So last week I was playing around with the editor, and here let's open up a map in the editor real quick. Doesn't matter which map. Here we'll open up this map. So I was playing around, and I was like, when you're in the map, it would be nice to make it feel like these little villages weren't just sort of sitting there in space. Like it would be nice if the little villages felt like they were part of the environment. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we put some farms around it? And then I noticed that somebody at some point had actually made a farm. And I was like, hey, look at that. There's a fucking farm in my game. I didn't know it was here. Now, no, the farm was incorrectly built, right? And by incorrectly built, for one thing, they've actually tied the tile to the structure. So if I set it down, it looks fucking ugly, right? I mean, let's face it, that looks fugly, right? Two, it's got fences around it, and fences in our game means walls, which actually have game significance. So I'm like, I can't really have the fences there. And then three, it's kind of a weird square, and it sits on the hex weird and kind of throws off my sense of perspective in a way that I'm not comfortable with. So all of that bothered me, but I did like the idea of having a farm. Now, interestingly, they put a farm in as a structure, and I thought, hey, you know what might be a cool idea? Why don't we, instead of putting the farm in as a structure, because we actually have a farm. There's actually a farm object. Where is it? Somewhere in here. I swear to God, we have a farm. Where the hell's my farm? I know it was right there, and I just scrolled over it, and I didn't see it. I swear to God, we have a farm. There it is right there. So, I mean, we have a farm, right? There's a farm. I mean, you could put a farm in the game already, right? So I thought, well, we already have a farm. Maybe it would be cool if instead of just having a sort of that, what if we had the fields around the farm? So you could have a farm and then you could have fields. And then I thought, hey, instead of actually having that be a structure, because when you have a structure, you have to actually take over the structure and you have to, defend it. And I thought that's kind of weird to have a farm that you could defend. And I thought, you know what, let's just actually put in a farm as a tile type. And on the surface of it, it's quite easy. Create a tile, put some farm stuff on top of the tile, and bing bada boom, there's your farm, right? And there's a farm tile, right? So we made a farm tile. Now, obviously, as you can see, it's fucking ugly, right? And then suddenly, all of the shit happens, right? And when I say all of the shit, it's I thought that I could do this thing relatively easily, but then when I actually did it and started to realize how many things it touched on and how many things it affected, it suddenly turned from a thing that I thought Greg could do in an hour into a thing that still isn't done, right? And I'll walk you through some of it. So part of it was, well, we had to come up with a good base tile to put the farm on. As you can see, the base tile that Greg came up with looks pretty ugly, actually. Then on top of that, you're like, okay, and keep in mind, this isn't feature creep in the sense of I kept asking for new stuff to be done to it, right? What I wanted was just a farmland tile that had the farmland ability, which I had already made, right? It's already done. No new features were added, but just making everything work with those features. So for instance, you'll notice if I put this farm down on top of the road, well, Chris didn't think that part through. When you have a road, you have to think about how does the road cut through the farm and how does it remove decals from the farm. And so the decals that have been made for the farm, which you can see are sort of those kind of big square decals, don't really fit with the road. So now we have to figure out, how do we put the road around the farm? Do we just have the road cut through the farm? Can we draw the road on top of the farm? Well, actually, no, we can't draw the road on top of the farm. Laying system doesn't work like that. All right, so we need to make some decals that the road can go around. And so I asked for that to be done, but they didn't really understand how I asked for that to be done. So it kind of got done wrong. And so now we have to do it again. And actually, we're still at that part in the process where Nelson is still supposed to be making decals sort of based on how that needs to work. Then it got into questions of, does the farm itself look good? Does the color look good? If I put some farms around this thing and the road doesn't really work the way I want it to, does it actually look like farms? Then we got into, oh, look, the layering between the farm and the water isn't right. And if you look over here where there's not farms, I've got little coastline and blah, 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 and it's all automatically done. But, we hadn't layered the farm properly, so when I put the farm on the coast, it doesn't actually do that, and blah, 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 blah. And suddenly this thing that was I could just do this, that was Friday. It's now Thursday, and we're still like halfway done with that feature. And that's That's game development. And when people wonder why does it take so long to make shit, um, that's why. Now, Merlin actually asks a relatively decent question over in chat where he says, "Why the fuck do you need farms?" And that's the thing. We don't. I mean, that's a quick answer. It's not something that this game needed. Now, I thought when we made the single player missions, how do we make the single player mission maps more interesting? How do we give them some character? How do we make, when I'm telling a story and in the story, oh, you're going to go to the farming village of whatever and do this thing. I thought it would be nice if the, scene kind of looked like that, right? But there is, I mean, and I stand behind that. I think that was the right decision, and I'm going to fight the good fight, and I'm going to keep going until the farms work. And the farms will work. Sooner or later, we'll have good-looking farms. I promise you that will happen. But that question that Merlin is asking is a question that I think doesn't get asked enough in game development, where you say, I'm going to do this thing, and like I say, at the beginning of the process, you think to yourself, I'm just going to do this thing and it's going to be really easy to do. A, did you really walk through all the shit that it's going to touch? Did you really walk through how big a deal it's going to be? Because if you do, then you can do the math of, well, what's the upside? The upside is it makes my farming areas look cooler. I can, and one of the things we've been doing lately is adding traits to terrain so that terrain actually has meaning. So fighting in a forest is different than fighting in a jungle, blah, blah, blah. So now I've got a new place where I can fight, and that has some sort of, so that's kind of neat. But mostly, I mean, honestly, mostly I wanted it in there for the visuals to make the maps look a little more interesting, because the maps are starting to kind of all look the same to me, and I wanted to have some more stuff in there that makes the maps look special. And I remember Campaign 4, because Campaign 4 had this map that had all the farmland. That would be cool. That's the honest reason I wanted it there. But you have to do the mental math of, these are the reasons why I wanted this thing in the game. Are those reasons good enough to validate the amount of work that's going to have to happen to make this thing happen? And without a clear idea of how much work is going to be involved, you can't do that mental math. And on this particular job, I still stand behind it as being the right thing to do. But I will say flat out, I underestimated how much work was involved in changing it from one thing to the other. And there is a reasonably decent argument for, hey, Chris, couldn't you just gotten this farm that looked, this farm object that looked reasonably good right here? Couldn't you have just made that turned a little bit so it didn't upset you so much, kept it as a structure and not done anything else? Maybe that would have been a better solution to your problem. And there's a reasonably good argument for that as well. So yeah, that's a thing. So Merlin asks, why do they need to be a terrain type instead of being a buildable structure? Again, it's a valid question. There's two ways that you can handle the farm yards, right? If you make them a structure, because the way the game works, structures can be taken. They can be taken over and they can be owned. If I make the fields a thing that can be owned, then that's sort of like one more thing you got to deal with. And I didn't want it to be a case where it's like I got a whole bunch of victory points because I wandered and took over a bunch of farms. And if you think about like this plus all the farms around it, maybe it would have been kind of boring to have your player one by one be like, oh, take a farm, take a farm, take a farm, take a farm. I could be wrong in that. I mean, there's a case to be made for maybe that's more interesting. And there's a case to be made for, well, if you do that, then you could raise the farms and you could destroy the farms, and so now I could destroy somebody's farmland. There's a case to be made for that. And I'm not sure. Maybe I've made the wrong call. But my feeling was it was simpler and easier just to call fields fields and not have to do that, right? So, I mean, all of these decisions, there's always sort of a second guessing that you can do. There's always a different way that it could have been done. So actually, a mountain isn't a structure. The farm is, or the mountain is a terrain. So everything in the game either has to be the base terrain or it has to be the structure. So if you look at the, here, let me reload this map real quick so I don't have all this fucking farmland on it. Um, I don't want to save that. Now I want to create a map. Chris doesn't know how. I don't want to do that. I want to load this map again. Where was this map? There. So here's this map in its pristine state. So in its pristine state, you've kind of got two things on a map. One, you've got the terrain, which is, you know, ocean, jungle, swamp, blah, blah, blah. And then you can place things on the terrain, right? Now, the mountains, for instance, are impassable. And you can see this is actually takes up 3 hexes worth of space. Now, we have a whole world of mountains of varying sizes. Here's a 3 hex mountain, or a 4 hex mountain, or even a 6 hex mountain. And obviously I can, you know, put these next to each other if I wanted and make, you know, great big huge mountain ranges if I felt so inclined. I have found in testing that doing that too much in a map makes a map a little less interesting, because I can't, these are impassable. These are things I can't get past. So now I've basically said on this map, you have to go this way or you have to go that way, because there's no way across that. To which I know some people are like, well, what about flying creatures? No, flying creatures can't cross mountains, because then we run into all kinds of problems about somebody could take a flying creature and stick it right here and nobody could get to it unless you have a flying creature, and blah, 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 blah. So the decision was made, impassable means impassable even for flying creatures. So anyway, if you put a whole bunch of mountains down like this, you have this big impassable thing. So anyway, really you've got impassable tiles, you got walkable tiles, and you've got structures. And once you have a structure, all the structures kind of have to follow the same rules so that people understand what they mean and what they do. So once I have a structure, that's a thing that I can actually own. So I can take it over, I can destroy it, I can improve it. I get benefits from owning it. You don't actually own terrain. So I don't own a jungle. I just happen to be in the jungle. I own the building. I don't own the jungle. So when we made farms, we had to make the decision, is it going to be a thing you can own, or is it going to be a thing that you just happen to be standing on? Either one of those decisions is a valid decision. And I think there's pros and cons with either decision. Had we gone the direction where I said, you know what, let's just make farms into structures and we'll make a cool looking structure that sits on top of the road and does whatever it does, I would have been able to take over the farm. I would have gotten victory points for owning the farm. That sort of thing. I could certainly have done it that way. The other direction that we could have gone with it is to make it into a terrain tile. We make it into a terrain tile. Well, now I can just stand on it and get benefits from it without actually having to take it over. So the question was about the pacing of the game. And do I want to force, you know, if I had put, let's say here, I'll put some ugly farms down. Let's say I had surrounded my my building with some ugly farms. Let me get rid of these roads so I actually have a farm. Do I want the player to take over all of those farms one by one? Is that interesting? I'm not sure that's fun gameplay. Might have been. I don't know. But that's the decision I made. I may go back on it. We'll see. But in any case, even with the farms being as ugly as they are right now, I can squint a little bit and imagine, like, it's kind of nice to see something that looks like it was made by human hands over here on the left-hand side where it's got the little straight rows and stuff. Imagine that it doesn't have these ugly hex barriers on the, here, I'll make this look a little bit better. I'll surround it with some forest. So imagine that it looked, you know, a little bit better than it does now. So it kind of already is getting sort of somewhere that's not too ugly, right? So now I can be like, oh, all right, cool. I can see on this map, oh, that's a human area over there. And for me, visually, that's interesting. So, you know, one of the things is if I made it into a structure, that's a lot of structures to interact with and to deal with. And like Ben says, having to take every farm by farm sounds a little tedious to me. So I would probably end up being like, all right, well, let's not have so many farms because it's tedious, and let's only have those 2 farms. But here you see that's a visually different story, right? So now, you know, okay, looks kind of cool, but that's visually very different than what I had before. And, you know, these are the sort of questions we ask. Are the answers that I'm coming up with always the right answers? No. I'm intelligent enough to know that I make wrong decisions quite often. And in fact, I had a whole conversation with Monica about that yesterday, where I was talking about how often I make wrong decisions. But sometimes you gotta, you can analyze something to death and be like, oh, I could do it this way or I could do it that way. Sometimes you just gotta make a call and say, let's do it like this, and let's see if it's good. And if it's not, we go back and do it a different way. And this sort of iterative way of doing game design is, I mean, to be very honest, it's slow. But these are sort of, I'm trying to think how to put this. Sometimes you gotta go try something and play it and be like, I think it's going to be better if we do it this way, or, oh no, I played it and it sucks, we got to do it a different way. So yeah, to your question of why can't it be on a single tile, it could be. I just don't think it visually looks as good. All right, sure, that kind of looks like a farm, sort of. I just think that's, sort of, and I'm in my mind, I'm thinking of like old medieval villages that, the farmland stretched out, to the horizon all around the building. The farms are actually quite big. One little farm is one thing, but the idea that farm is, farmland. I think a lot of this map, you have to kind of question like what the scale is on this. And I think a lot of this is sort of representational. How big is this mountain versus that mountain? One thing, I'll take a little aside. It's going to be story time for a moment. So I was making Far Cry back in the day, and when I was doing Far Cry, I had a bunch of people complain to me because they were like, wow, Chris, your trees they seem weird. They don't seem sized like real trees. And I was like, all right, let's actually look into that. Let's see how big a tree is. So I went and looked up the height of trees. Specifically, I was making the game. I wasn't in a jungle when we made that game. I was in a big forest in Germany, actually. And so I went and looked online, and I found, here's the kind of trees that we've got in our game, and here's how tall these trees are. And come to find out, they're big ass trees, right? So I got one of the artists to size up all the trees to real tree size. And then I put the rest of the stuff in next to the real size jungle trees. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a jungle before. Jungle trees are huge. Jungle vegetation is fucking huge. And suddenly our game looked really weird. Like it looked like comical. It looked like you were in like a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids kind of miniature world where all of the people were like that high, running around these great big huge trees. Interestingly enough, I had been in a jungle before. I had actually visited Taman Negara. It's a national park in Malaysia, and I had gone and been there. And I pulled out some images of myself in that park, and I looked. And only when I thought about it and looked about, with that in my mind, when I looked at the trees, I was like, holy shit, I was really small next to those trees. Look at this picture. And it's a picture of me in a jungle next to a tree. I had been there, but even having been there and been that tall next to a big ass tree, when I made a game, when I put the tree at the same size and saw myself at the same size, it looked weird to me because we're not used to things actually being represented in games the way they actually are sized, right? In that same example, I had also been told, make all the buildings the same size, the real size next to the tree. So I actually got some floor plans out, and looked at how big, like I can't remember what I looked at. I found a blueprint for like a shopping mall, I think. And so we sized things the size of a shopping mall. And I got in there, and in a first person shooter, if you actually build things the size they actually are, they're tiny. Like you walk into a room and the wall's right there in front of your face, and you feel totally claustrophobic when you're in one of those rooms. And every room that I went in, I'm like, I can't even move. I can't do anything in this room. This is so tiny. And then if you put furniture in that room, like you couldn't fucking walk for all the furniture. And I challenge you to do this. Whatever room you're in now, actually look around and look and see how much space you have around your furniture. And what you realize is your house is actually this tiny little rat maze of tiny little passages around the furniture that actually dominates your room. Now, if you go into any first person shooter game and look at a room, you will notice that it's all empty space with little tiny furniture sort of shoved into the corners and stuff, because that's the way it looks right in a game. So that's my little lecture on scale and how scale works in games. And there is reality and there's games. And if you're trying to duplicate reality in games, be aware that it's not always going to read correctly. Sometimes it reads very incorrectly, which gets me back to our game and questions about how big is a mountain, or how big is an ocean, or how big is a village. Now, if I wanted to make a world where things were real sized, the actual truth is the distance between villages is ginormous, and mountains are fucking huge. And you know, if I were to make a map of say a valley in Japan in the feudal period, and okay, here's the little village and here's the mountain, the map would be like that much mountain and like that much village and some little farms around it and a little road that ran through a really, really long forest, and it would, like, everything would look shit. Like everything that was, humans are so much smaller and our impact on the world is so much smaller than we think it is, that if we were to actually draw things with our real, I mean, if you don't believe me, if I can open up Google Maps and look at the countryside anywhere, right? And you'd be amazed at, you know, how much, even now, after we've totally dominated the world and destroyed all of nature and blah, 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 just look at a map of, you know, Eastern Washington and see how small the human bits are in comparison. And these are huge, massive, modern, you know, 2018 structures. Even your huge Walmart next to even a tiny hill is just like fucking that big, right? So yeah, that's my little, yeah, humans live on less than 1% of the planet. It's so yeah, so a lot of the maps and in strategy games and stuff are representational, I guess. And so yeah, there, that's my lecture on that.